This must have been due to the evil marriage of Joram to the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel, which corrupted his descendants. Ahab was the king of the northern kingdom, and his wife Jezebel was a wicked woman who was fully related to idols. Because she was one with the devil, she corrupted her husband. They brought forth a daughter, and Joram, one of the kings of Judah, married her. This woman taught Joram to worship idols, to be one with the idols. Thus their family was corrupted. According to Exodus chapter 20 verse 5, 3 generations of Joram's descendants were cut off from the generation of Christ. Exodus chapter 20 verse 5 says that anyone who forsakes God and worships idols corrupts himself and will suffer God's curse for 3 or 4 generations. Therefore, 3 generations of King Joram were cut off from genealogy of Christ. Here we must learn a lesson. If we would be associated with Christ, we should never be involved with anything related to idols. God is a jealous God, and he will never tolerate idolatry. Josiah begetting Jeconiah. Verse 11 says, Josiah begot Jeconiah. Compare this record with the sons of Josiah, the second Jehoiakim, the sons of Jehoiakim, Jeconiah his son. 1 generation, Jehoiakim was omitted from the genealogy of Christ. This must have been because he was made king by Pharaoh of Egypt and collected tax for Pharaoh. Because he was so closely related to Egypt, he was excluded from the genealogy of Christ. Egypt represents the world. From these 2 records, we see that anyone who is related to idols or associated with the world will be excluded from the generation of Christ. The captives to Babylon. Those who were carried away to Babylon as captives were indirectly related to Christ through their descendants, Joseph's marriage with Mary. Even these captives are included in this sacred record of Christ's genealogy because they had an indirect relationship to Mary, the mother of Jesus. Jeconiah. Jeconiah was not reckoned as a king in this genealogy because he was born during the captivity and was carried away as a captive. Jehoiakim is Jeconiah. According to the prophecy of Jeremiah chapter 22 verse 28 to 30, none of Jeconiah's descendants would inherit the throne of David. All of his descendants were cut off from David's throne. If Christ had been a direct descendant of Jeconiah, he would not have been entitled to the throne of David. Although Jeremiah chapter 22 verse 28 to 30 says that all the descendants of Jeconiah are excluded from the throne of David, the next chapter verse 5 says that God will raise up a branch to David, a king who will reign and prosper. This branch is Christ. This prophecy confirms that Christ will be the descendant of David, although not a direct descendant of Jeconiah, and will inherit the throne of David. Jeconiah begetting Salatiel, and Salatiel begetting Zerubbabel. Verse 12 says, Jeconiah begot Salatiel, and Salatiel begot Zerubbabel. Compare this record with that in 1 Chronicles chapter 3, verse 17 to 19. The sons of Jeconiah, Salatiel, and Pedaiah, the sons of Pedaiah was Zerubbabel, showing that Zerubbabel was the son of Pedaiah, Salatiel's brother. Zerubbabel was not Salatiel's son, but his nephew, who became his heir. Perhaps this was a case in accordance with Deuteronomy chapter 25 verse 5 and 6, which say that if a man dies without a son as his heir, his brother must bury his wife in order to produce a son to be his heir. Without this case, we cannot understand why there is such a regulation in Deuteronomy chapter 25. Even that word in Deuteronomy is related to the genealogy of Christ. Zerubbabel. Ezra chapter 5 verse 1 and 2 say that Zerubbabel was one of the leaders who returned to Jerusalem from the captivity of Babylon. This means that he was a leader in the Lord's recovery. This is a great thing. He was also a leader in the rebuilding of God's temple. Without this return from captivity, it would have been impossible for Christ to be born at Bethlehem. The Old Testament definitely predicted that Christ, as the descendant of David, would be born in Bethlehem. Suppose none of the people of Israel had returned to Judah, and the time came for Christ to be born at Bethlehem. No one would have been there. Now we can understand why God commanded the captives to return. God's commandment that the captives return was not only for the rebuilding of the temple, but also the preparation for Christ to be born in Bethlehem. It is exactly the same today. Some may ask, what is the difference between remaining at Babylon and returning to Jerusalem? Isn't it the same as long as we worship God and walk in the Spirit? It may be all right with you, but it is not all right with Christ. Christ needs some people to bring him to Bethlehem. You may worship God and you may walk in the Spirit in Babylon. But be assured that Christ could never be born into humanity through you. This requires a specific place. You must return from Babylon to Judah. When the time came for the Lord Jesus to be born, some Israelites, descendants of the returned captives, were waiting in Judah. At that time, Joseph and Mary were not in Babylon. They were in Judah. For Christ to come to earth, some of his captured people had to return. For his second coming, Christ also needs some of his captured people to return from their captivity to the proper church life. Jacob begetting Joseph. The genealogy here says Jacob begot Joseph. Luke chapter 3 verse 23 says Joseph the son of Heli, whose son was Joseph. Luke's record says as was supposed a literal translation would be as to the law. This indicates that Joseph was not actually the son of Heli, but was reckoned as his son according to the law. Joseph was the son-in-law of Heli, Mary's father. This might have been a case according to Numbers chapter 27 verse 1 to 8 and chapter 36 verse 1 to 12, in which a regulation was made by God that if any parents had only daughters as heirs, their inheritance should go to the daughters. The daughters then must marry a man of their own tribe in order to keep their inheritance within that tribe. If we did not have Matthew chapter 1, we may wonder why such a record exists. Now we see that this is not merely the record of a certain regulation. It is a matter related to Christ, because the virgin daughter who brought forth Christ was such a case. We believe that Mary's parents had no sons and that she inherited her parents' heritage and married Joseph, a man of the same tribe, the tribe of Judah. Even the regulation in Numbers chapter 27 and 36 is related to the genealogy of Christ, either directly or indirectly. The whole Bible is a record of Christ.